to reiterate what Keith talked about, which is these are, in my mind, the intermediate stopgap measures. What we need to be doing is moving towards these bioanalytical techniques that can screen large classes of compounds. And to that end, he mentioned it very passingly, but we have, we paid for a contract with Squirt to be evaluating the ability of these to, the use of these in out of the research laboratory into a more production environment, and we expect that results from that panel's work on that in 2014. So in a couple of years' time, I think that is the area that we need to be moving forward to. So.
What about the David and Lucile Packard Foundation? Have you talked with them about any follow-up activities?
We have not gone any farther with them. I think they're very happy with what's happened now, and based on the results what we hear today, I'll be talking to them some more.
Okay. And there actually may be other philanthropic foundations. I mean, when you do talk with them, I think you should explore with them if there are other philanthropic foundations that might be interested in this work, not just here in California, but you know, all over the country.
Will do.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you have to go all over the country to talk to them, John. You can
my understanding,
pick up the phone and give them a ringy-ding, huh?
I understand there's some organizations in the south of France that...
they have phone service.
Okay.
We are partnering with a national organization on the recycle side, the Water Reuse Research Foundation, for those bioanalytical tool development. So that's one partner we've found so far.
Good. I just wanted to point out, thank you for the presentation, and I appreciate staff's trying to lay groundwork in terms of developing tools, because I think the question of on-ramp is the subject of a lot of public interest, you know, as we'll hear from the public. And so I just wanted to point out also that there's a higher level coordination that we're aware of on the state board in terms of you know, product registration aspects of this, and the screening tools that you're contemplating with bioanalytical technique development and that sort of thing, but also just the framework you've developed. I want to encourage coordination with other Cal EPA departments on this, because they're genuinely interested. They need some help from us, from the water side. You know, whether it be Department of Toxic Substance Control or Cal Recycle, you know, in terms of these issues. So it touches on, you know, the products we use, all of us in this room, and how some of them may end up in water and may have effects. And so it's real important for us to go about this in a methodical way, be committed, work with the foundations that are interested in funding it, and develop these techniques to sustain a commitment to keeping an eye on the constituents in wastewater and recycled water. Thanks.
Phil Freeze, would you like to come up?
Good morning, Chair Hoppen, board members. My name is Phil Freeze. I'm the Technical Services Department Head for the Sanitation Districts of Los Angeles County. But today I'm representing the California Association of Sanitation Agencies and TriTAC, which represent public wastewater agencies that serve millions of Californians. Bobby Larson asked me to fill in for her today. She's out of the country on vacation and could not be here today. I'd like to start by saying that we are...
You need to speak much faster if you're filling in for Bobby.
I'm sorry.
You've heard those people that do the disclaimers for automobile ads on TV. That's about the way she ramps it up. So we'll see if you can meet her standards. We don't agree with her. We just don't know what she says, and we finally nod our head and submit.
I'm supposed to slow down, I take it from...
No, you're doing fine. It's kind of just in-house gallows humor a little bit. So.
Sorry. I want to start by indicating that CAS is extremely pleased with the work the State Board has been undertaking to address CECs in aquatic ecosystems. And we believe your staff should be highly commended for its efforts. We strongly support the approach taken by staff to work with SQUIRP to convene an expert panel to develop recommendations. We appreciate the open, transparent process used during the expert panel activities. Stakeholders were allowed to easily monitor the process and provide input at appropriate times throughout the process. And we believe the scientists chosen by the panel or for the panel were extremely well qualified. We believe the expert panel's risk-based approach was vastly superior to a piecemeal approach in which recommendations are based on more limited expertise and data. The regulated community is generally very well pleased with the work of the expert panel. We believe the panel has recommended a sensible, scientifically sound approach to addressing effects of CECs in aquatic ecosystems. We support the conclusions of the panel, and we believe that the panel has identified appropriate compounds for initial monitoring. We support implementation of the follow-on work recommended by the panel, including the Phase 2 monitoring and special studies, followed by Phase 3 reassessment of the data, and Phase 4 guidance for development of action plans for consideration by the state. To move forward with implementation of the panel's recommendations, the POTW community strongly supports the voluntary approach that Mr. Bishop referred to a moment ago, in which the Water Board would work with regional monitoring programs and individual entities to conduct the Phase 2 monitoring and special studies. For ocean discharges, the Southern California BITE program is already considering including this monitoring as a part of the BITE 13 effort. For effluent-dominated water bodies, some monitoring studies have already been conducted in Southern California in cooperation with SQUIRP, and these studies could be aligned and expanded to include the required monitoring. We do recommend the State Water Board provide staff to coordinate the statewide efforts to ensure that no gaps remain and to provide monetary support to reconvene the expert panel to review monitoring plans and conduct the Phase 3 analysis and interpretation of the Phase 2 results. We believe that that approach would be more efficient than having SWAMP conduct that assessment, as it would build on the existing efforts and avoid any duplication. If there were insufficient volunteers to conduct the Phase 2 monitoring, we think that existing SWAMP funding could be redirected to cover this program. However, we would be opposed to increasing permit fees to fund this program. POTWs did have to accommodate a substantial fee increase last year to make up for the loss in general funds, and further increases on top of this would probably not be very well received. While addressing CECs is a priority, we think that funds used for more traditional monitoring could be reallocated temporarily to cover any necessary costs. However, we do believe that a combination of regional monitoring programs and individual agency voluntary monitoring will probably be sufficient to implement Phase 2. Thank you for this opportunity to provide input on the Water Board's direction on CECs, but most of all, thank you for the outstanding expert panel process that you implemented to bring us to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Phil, could I ask you a quick question? I understand the tension here between, a voluntary approach, which, would be ideal in terms of if we could get a good statewide picture. I'm concerned by just going that route, we're not going to get a statewide picture. We're just going to get, you know, the folks who happen to be focusing on it, and staff you can weigh into. But could there be some sort of model, like, for instance, I think of the Bay Area where I'm familiar, there's always some special study funds within the regional monitoring program. A lot of these are actually already trying to answer some of the questions that this panel has delved into further. So I need a little more of a comfort zone to endorse a voluntary approach, that there are sufficient mechanisms and funding in place and momentum to build on the panel's recommendations. I don't quite have that, given all of the caveats in your comments. Is there a hybrid approach where we, you know, as a state board could create a resolution of some sort that this monitoring is going to happen, and then you can use your voluntary efforts to meet that? You know, that I feel that in order to get the work done, we may have to go beyond simple voluntary. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think that's a possibility. I think we ought to give the voluntary approach a chance to work if there's a mechanism to do that. I'm quite confident that with regard to the case studies that are to be performed in Southern California, that you will see adequate volunteerism to get those done. I think some of the special studies that SQUIRP is already performing will satisfy some of the special study requirements, the bioanalytical tool development. I'm not sure that an antibiotic resistance special study has been commissioned yet, but I think that a lot of progress is being made, and I think the case studies for the monitoring cases for Southern California are going to be very doable on a voluntary basis in Southern California. I think through SFEI and those kinds of organizations, it's likely to be the case in Northern California. If it looks like those are going to fall short, then I think your hybrid's probably appropriate. I'd give it a chance if it's possible to do so.
Let me reassure the board members that we're not proposing to just kind of throw this out there and see if anyone volunteers. We're actually, I've tasked our swamp folks to be the coordinator of this activity, to work with SFEI and with SQUIRP to look at this. I guess my recommendation would be, given that that we have had indications of willingness to step forward and do this, that we develop what needs to be essentially the monitoring program. Might be pulling together existing studies that are ongoing and adding to them, or creating new ones. And then if at that point there is some resistance, I will probably make a recommendation to Tom or back to you that we issue some orders at that point that there are some gaps that need to be filled. But I have had, I feel fairly confident from my discussions with Bobby Larson that the CASA and TriTech are very much on board with doing the studies that need to be done.
Normally I like to listen to everybody first, so forgive me if this is going to come up, and forgive me if this is too simple a question. On this one, and to a certain extent the issue we're going to talk about later, probably more so, or less so, the issue later, I'm trying to figure out the purpose, in a sense, of the monitoring and how much we need in order to figure out what action to take. So just in my simple mind, let's just think about this. It seems to me that contaminants of emerging concern, I'm thrilled you're this far on it. I have an emergency room feeling about it as a species that I want to know the answer, and have ever since the first stories came out about caffeine and endocrine disruptors and all that in Lake Mead in particular. When I was still at EPA, it was one of those things that led me to leave the parts per billion world for a while, because I was a little freaked out about it, and go into land conservation, which was sort of more direct, you could see it done, et cetera. And as I return to this world, and I'm very excited to be back, I'm still concerned and alarmed about it. But as I think about what we need to know, and this is just to help me understand it, and also whoever can answer the question, it'd be fine. We need to figure it out for the purpose of for the sake of oversimplification, either tracing back where a contaminant comes from and banning it or doing something about it, as in the case of flame retardants or whatever, where there's a thing you can do to say, let's get this product out of the waste stream in whatever way we can. Or in the case of a wide class of pharmaceuticals and caffeine, you're not going to start telling people not to pee, right? So you're going to have to deal with it in the context of wastewater, and I'm not going to give up my coffee, you know, so that leads you to what are the treatment levels that you need, or the treatment technologies we're going to need to get to. And so my question comes, to figure out what we need to do there, do we need to monitor everywhere? Or can we just do these pilots in particular cases and places, or, you know, maybe a small place and a big place, or an array of descriptive places, to figure out when we need to start triggering those actions?
So I think there's those are both correct. It's not an or, it's an and. We need to determine where there are constituents of concern that are crossing a threshold that require action because they are impacting either human health or the environment in a way that we can quantify, and that's that's the model of the ratio that they're talking about, where if you have a high enough ratio that leads to some action. Now, that action is one of many things, but you described two of the major ones, which are if these are items that can be replaced in the production and they're of high enough concern. You know, DDT was a good example of that kind of an action. That's one route. They may be ubiquitous in our system. We're not going to give up caffeine. People are not going to do that. If caffeine, using that as an example, is causing an excessive problem in the environment, then we would need to look at treatment that could take care of that. But I think there's a third and a fourth part to this. The third is it's unclear in many instances how much of this gets through the treatment process, and are the levels that we're seeing of concern in the environment. So that needs to be addressed also. And then there's a fourth, is that we, as a regulatory agency, as a wastewater treatment agency, as the whole community, as the environmental community, we need to be paying attention to it. And so that's where this came from, I guess, in many ways, was the idea that we need to pay attention to it, and we need to do it in a scientific and systematic way, as opposed to choosing essentially at random your CEC of choice. And so that's the way we got to this piece. But in the end, if we have these parts per billion or parts per trillion levels that are causing an impact in the environment, we then have to figure out, okay, now, is this amenable to some sort of product exchange or restriction, or do we need to upgrade treatment, or are we taking care of it with our existing treatment? And those are the kind of questions that these special studies are meant to look at.
Yeah, and I'd add, and that's excellent, John, I'd add also the bioanalytical techniques, and that screening process can help us from the water side inform the product registration process.
And that is and to me, the end game is if we can do by impacts on the cellular level, whole classes of compounds, we are much better able to make the case that we need to focus in on this class of chemical or not.
Right.
John, could you put to ease the rumor that you're considering banning coffee drinking women south of the Tehachapi's?
I will at this moment confirm that we are not going to be banning caffeine as any one of our proposed actions, though we will restrict any discharge from POTW of caffeine.
Ms. Adelman, would you like to follow all that?
Thank you very much. Brenda Edelman from Russian River Watershed Protection Committee.
I've done that twice to you. I've called you Adelman when it's Edelman. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
I mispronounced your name 2 different times. I apologize about that.
Oh, that's fine. That's how most people do it. I basically came here to comment mostly on the next item, but I first want to thank you for your efforts in this, on this issue. I have been very concerned about this issue for a long time, and in fact in 1995 our group in Santa Rosa put on a big conference with Theo Colburn came, and Lou Gillette, who's famous with alligators in Florida, and Michael Fry, who's a bird expert, and the stories they were telling then were terrifying about this issue. And a lot of time has gone by since then, and I hope that we can move forward in a meaningful way through this process. The big concern I have that not all of these chemicals are being addressed, and I'll go into more detail in the next item, but in March of this year, a new study came out that obviously was not part of this process, and it was completed by 12 scientists looking at over 800 studies. These scientists were in the fields of endocrinology, cancer biology, ecology, developmental biology, and epidemiological work. And they were looking at the low dose hypothesis, which was hinted at earlier, but was not really discussed. And I'm not a scientist, but my layperson understanding of that issue is that certain endocrine disrupting chemicals, and there are many of them, I think they've identified close to 1,000 at this point in time, have devastating effects on humans and wildlife. And I can understand why you want to go through the risk assessment process, but there may need to be some special consideration of the issue of endocrine disruption. It's affecting species. Dr. Tyrone Hayes at UC Berkeley has done a lot of work with atrazine in frogs and has seen beyond a doubt, and I've heard him and seen pictures of it, where the male frogs exposed to atrazine in the parts per billion range develop male and female organs. And there are many, many examples of this type of thing going on now. And this study is a 75-page study. I turned it in as part of the record. I spoke with Dr. Laura Vandenberg, who was the lead author on the study, and she consented to write an article that is in the packet, in the record for the next item. And she also submitted, well, a letter and an article. And I also submitted, I hope you have got copies of this magazine. This is the great, it's wonderful. The articles in here are incredible, and they're readable at the layperson level, so we can all understand it very well. San Francisco Medical Society did this special issue on environmental health, where many of the articles address this issue. And there are things, I mean, it's affecting issues around heart disease, cancer, autism, birth defects. They're even linking obesity and diabetes to exposures to these chemicals. And it's entirely possible that when you irrigate with this water, it gets into the soils and gets taken up by the plants. I've been trying to get hold, there are people who have done studies on this. And we could be very easily being exposed to this through our food. And so that's why I was so concerned about the irrigation with this wastewater, and I'll talk about that more later. But I would like you to give, see, the conventional risk assessment doesn't really help in this situation because it's the minute doses that have the major effect on the endocrine system. And there are people that can explain this better than I can scientifically, but there's a lot of work being done on this now. And I would hope that you would examine the work of these other scientists before you make any hard and fast decisions about this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Garbedian?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Hadn't planned to address this item, but the CEC monitoring program is nothing but piecemeal. It is an initial effort that doesn't even begin to go far enough. We need a plan. We need to tackle CECs overall and not have something like this which purports to be doing something about CCCs, but is just a very minor step on the way. One of the critical problems with before the monitoring report was the advisory committee itself made a determination not to look into monitoring unless there were established protocols for the chemical. I mean, this is a failing of the report to not go beyond that. It's just a major failing. And in 1982, I testified to Congress for the Sierra Club on the Clean Water Act reauthorization. The major issue there was the pollution in the New York Bight of at the sewage dump site. I testified there on the question of the industrial pretreatment program and how that needed to be implemented and strengthened regulatory-wise to deal with the problem of the toxics coming out of sewer plants. I'm not going to have time to stay for the next item, but I was going to address that in more detail. It just seems to me ironic now that we're talking about the sewer districts advocating a solution that is inadequate to address the problems of the Southern California Bight. I think you should act and avoid the need for banning or other activity. Thank you. And certainly you should make the monitoring mandatory at least.
Thank you. That's the last of the cards I have. Do you have any comment?
As I was reading this material last night and thinking about what I want to say on this issue, I think I'm going to...
You weren't watching Monday Night Football?
No, I wasn't, actually.
Oh.
Who won? Who played? I think I'm going to toss out a cautionary note to my colleagues and to staff. As you know, I've been championing our resource alignment effort and the need for us to look at our resources, how our resources are used, and prioritizing the use of those resources. And as I consider this issue of CEC monitoring, I appreciate that it's an important matter that we should pay attention to, but I also want to caution us in going down this path without perhaps first carefully considering what our objectives are and then laying out a pathway to get there. Because all of us, I think, who've worked in this area knows that if you look for CECs, you will find them. If you monitor for them, you will find them. They're everywhere. There will continue to be more and more as we innovate and create, more chemicals and to meet our various needs. And so, back to, I think, Felicia's comment, where are we going with this? And before we just open the door and the floodgates to this issue, I don't know that we've had a discussion as a board and invite, stakeholders to provide input on this very important yet potentially very expensive issue. I know that our regulated community is already doing quite a bit of monitoring through the various permits that we issued, and they're looking at potential, new requirements from us in stormwater, in biological objectives, in a myriad of factors. And now we're talking about, perhaps someday additional CEC monitoring. We'll have a next item, I guess, CEC monitoring in recycled water. So this is an important issue, but I don't want us to just move forward. I think at some point we need to have a discussion of how to prioritize, and perhaps this will be the priority, I don't know yet, the resources we have, including the research funding that we have, which I know is limited and is getting more limited every day. And one of the things that I had hoped, and I'm looking at Karen, when we formed the Office of Research Planning and Performance, the research part of it, was to find a way to better understand the inventory of research that exists so that we don't duplicate it, but also the inventory of research that we are currently funding, and then identify the list of research priorities that we have coming up and find a way to do this in a more thoughtful, strategic manner versus a, gosh, EEC is important, we must go do this, and this is important, we must go do that. Then we end up doing a little bit of everything without a coherent strategy. So while I appreciate all the work that has been done on this issue, and I certainly support the idea that we need to pay attention to this, I agree with Felicia that perhaps we do need to have a discussion and a framing of our objectives and goals and actions in this area.
So I just want to reassure the board that that's the reason we put together the scientific panel that we did, so as it not to run out and just start monitoring and requiring monitoring for monitoring's sake, but that they had a framework to address it and a rationale for every monitoring requirement.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
The very last recommendation the panel made was basically addressing what you just talked about, was assessing the relative risk of CECs to what is currently being monitored, priority or legacy pollutants. So it is an important issue in a world of finite resources to, like you say, prioritize and understand what the relative risks are.
And I'm curious, and I'm sort of changing the topic a little bit, but at some point, do we ever talk about stop monitoring certain constituents, or do we keep adding to the list of things that we monitor? I think one of the things I would like to see as we further discuss and flesh out our monitoring priorities and strategy is how much is enough? I mean, do we just continue to add on and do more research and do monitoring? What is the end goal, and how do we know when we get there?
Unlike Tam, and this is rare, I actually feel like we are on a very strong, limited course. There are on-ramps and there are off-ramps. And that gets at some of your question about do we ever stop? Well, of course, that's what I assume that's what an off-ramp is for. So, so I actually think this is a very strong and anticipatory. This issue is frightening, as we've heard from some of the speakers, and it is something that is discussed. And there are an increasing number of books that are coming out on it, and research folks that are involved, and they're looking at increasingly smaller doses. And I know that this panel, to the person who spoke earlier about wanting to make sure that we were looking at low dose effects, this panel is definitely looking at low dose effects. So I am actually very comforted, unlike so many of the other programs that I've seen, that this is being done in as cautious and but aggressive a way as possible, because the most important thing we need to do is to be able to confidently assure the public that we are taking appropriate actions, not just the regulated public, but the general public as well. And the only way we can get there in a fairly short period of time, and 2 or 3 years, in my opinion, is quite short, is by pursuing the plan that's been laid out in front of us. And I really applaud SQUIRP and our staff for working on this. And I for one feel quite reassured, actually. I do think, in terms of I think as long as there is a protocol for the kinds of data that you need to gather, there are various places that we can gather it. One is the so-called voluntary approach, finding those agencies statewide that have the information that we need and let them know that that's the information we need, and I suspect we will get lots of volunteers out of that. I assume you're talking with the green chemistry folks in other parts of this building, because they too are looking at some issues associated with products, and they should be certainly a part of what we're doing. They should certainly know about what we're doing as well. I know the foundation community, which is very supportive of Clio and others in looking at CECs, they should be very interested in what we're doing, because we're taking it from the theoretical and really frightening place down to a practical application place in a way that is defensible in court, is defensible in the public arena, and is defensible in terms of data requirements or treatment requirements that we're going to eventually have to put onto dischargers. So I think that we need to be looking at a number of different funding sources so that all the burden doesn't fall just on the volunteer wastewater plants, but or the volunteer water plants. So I guess but I do think if we start with a good framework, which sounds like we're getting, and we see what we can get from our dischargers and what we can do in terms of partnerships, I will be comfortable with John and Tom making the decision to move to kind of the next level if we need to, because we need to get on this very fast. We need to get it done.
It's so rare that Fran and I disagree on anything, and I don't necessarily disagree with the intent, her intent, and the importance of this effort. But I guess for me, it comes back down to the issue of prioritizing, and as a matter of priority, my preference, and I don't know that it's come down to having to choose between priorities, and perhaps that's a resource discussion that we need to have at some point. But as we start looking at CECs, I'm mindful of the problems that currently exist, like with nitrates, arsenic, and all sorts of other things that are currently impacting communities right now, and just want to make sure that as we go forward and explore this area cautiously and carefully, that we're mindful of the existing needs that communities and others have in terms of additional research, funding, cleanup, and just everything else. So I don't know, obviously today is not the appropriate timing to have that kind of discussion, but again, I would caution us to consider the broader scope of all the needs and responsibilities that we have, and really look at prioritizing not just our resources, but also where our staff should be spending their time, whether it be, in the monitoring program or the research program or the regulatory programs.
Can I make a suggestion? Because I don't know if it's an issue of agreement or disagreement. I mean, I actually think this is something we have to hop on, and I like the fact that you all have started on this path in a thoughtful way. But I do think this is an issue not just for the state of California, it's an issue nationally and internationally. So I'd like to know at some point where EPA is on this, where their funding is, what their thinking is. This should be, I won't call it a Manhattan Project or a moonshot. I can't find the right metaphor into figuring this stuff out in a way that has broad applicability. That's why, going back to my initial thought, which probably got lost in all the other things I said when I brought it up, my question may well have been lost, which is, in your options, you're looking at how we might pay for more monitoring or how we might have everybody monitor. And my question is more, do we really need to monitor everywhere to figure out at what point we need to ban a chemical, or design a different level of treatment, for which obviously you would then have everybody monitor to see if that treatment worked. And so you could then, I'm sorry, my point is, could we combine our resources in a research project of representative samplings of places, whether it was enclosed water bodies versus open ocean, et cetera, so that we could get a quicker sense of what we might need to do to take action on this.
And that's exactly what we're talking about.
Okay, I just didn't see it when I looked at your options the same way. I may just be looking at a different...
It's because I didn't describe what the phase 2 and 3 were, and they are a pilot study to look at scenarios and not every discharge, but to pick ocean discharge, to pick a enclosed bay and estuary, to pick a inland water, and do that exactly what you're talking about to determine, is it important to monitor these at every place before we actually go there? And that's what we're talking about.
Okay, maybe I got lost in your options for monitoring for phase 2 and 3 in the staff draft.
John,
That's what phase 2 and 3 are.
But it says to require all of the permits to monitor.
Well, that was one of the ways to get there.
Or charge everybody. So you charge everybody to do the collective work?
Yes, that's
Oh,
one of the
okay.
ways to get
I didn't get that. Okay. Because I do think dischargers at some point, I know there's a limit, are going to have to pay for this, and it is totally in their interest to have this done. Although we should do it in the most efficient way we can. There is, this one getting, I don't know that we're ahead of the curve. We may be late. I haven't decided. But this is one where we really do, I think, need to put pedal to the metal to figure out what it is we do need to do next. So I'm going to go back and read it again and talk to you more afterward.
John, what I would suggest, obviously, we have certain differences of opinion here that all kind of point to the same direction in many respects. I would suggest maybe you make the rounds with the board members before you head to the south of France and see if we can come up with a bit more consensus that we're going to reach today. If not, we'll figure out an appropriate time to get together and have that discussion. We seem to have a difficult time having off-site discussions, but maybe it's something we could winnow down to where we could deal with it after a board meeting in closed session or something like that. So.
I'd be happy to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to add just one thought. I agree with to Chair. What's interesting to me, having been in the program, is how this process that's coming out of California and our water board is filling a void that's been there for decades as far as a concerted effort to identify pollutants of concern. We had 126 priority pollutants established in the late 70s, early 80s. There was a process, there was funding for that. There's been no follow-up since then. You know, in the 90s we had diazonine and chlorpyrifos, kind of came out of toxicity-based evaluations. I mean, and now this is the type of methodical approach that we would hope to be seeing from more of a national perspective. So that's what I'm seeing with this discussion, prioritization of resources, what does EPA think? Fran's correct, I think, assessment of a focused effort. It reflects what, frankly, when I was a technician in this program, I expected to be coming from the federal government. And so I think this is a fantastic program. It's focused. It's responsive to TAM's valid concerns, which I uphold. I want us to be focused. But I see a lot of agreement on this, and I think this is caused by the lack of guidance on pollutant-specific guidelines and thresholds since the early 80s. And this is how we're responding. And I think it's science-based and careful and focused, and that's how I hope we can proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is we'll take a break. We've had people being courteous enough not to parade in and out of here, but some of us may need to parade out for a moment. We'll resume at 11 o'clock. This last item went a bit longer than I had anticipated. I had hoped to get to item number 10 before noon and possibly item number 11. I would say there's a possibility, depending on how long we go with item number 9, the public hearing, that we may take item number 11 out of order where it's a bit shorter than 10 and try and complete it. But certainly items 12, 13, and 14 will not be heard until after lunch. So with that, we'll take a break until 11 o'clock, and we will resume with the public hearing on item number 9.
Just so you know, EPA was actually the source of these, these assays, but they do it for chemical registration. They're starting to hear what we're doing, and we're getting calls from EPA. We're interested in that application. They'll come around, but they're just so minor.
Oh, supposedly they fixed it.
Yeah, but I don't trust it.
I don't know. I've got my own reporter.
Okay, cool. Aren't you new? I'm not sure. I think, I don't know. Anyway.
He's done similar.
So Fran had left. Yeah, I was going to ask. Southern California, meeting December 12th, and 13th, but not the 12th. The research was a little
I saw this morning.
That's my voice now yesterday. So I told her this morning I need to talk to you and figure out what to do. She said, obviously, you have to. Yeah, and that's what I'm trying. But I guess I need to find out more information. I don't even have the details right now. Yeah, so find out exactly. We'll try to dig that out.
Okay.
thought they were gonna maybe put Ken before us, or
He said we're up, but I may,
this, does anybody need this?
no. Unless we start projecting things later on.
I'll put it over in your call. And I guess the audio recording's back on. Melanie said.
According to Melanie.
I got mine going just in case.
Okay.
Hate to have
Like
to.
your own. No. Yeah. Okay. I'll go over. Okay. This is what I got. You had to have a finding and then evaluating.
That's great.
Okay. And this is the resolve.
I'll say the state board of
Okay. These, yeah, CCs identified for monitoring. Effective water policy. Under redemption.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's back on, but just in case we don't want to have to go back and hold some other hearings.
Right now. Well, that's why the minutes are the official record. Well, better check with them.
We will resume as soon as Mr. Lucas gets done with his phone call. It's turned on. Mr. Howard, would you introduce item number 9, please?
Yes, this item is similar to the one that the Water Board just heard, except instead of freshwater ecosystem. Oh. This item is similar to the one the Water Board's just heard, except instead of dealing with CECs and aquatic ecosystems, we're now looking at recycled water issues. So we have Gordon Innes again going to introduce the panel.
Okay. For the record, my name is Gordon Innes, and I'm a senior engineer. Oh, it's actually on.
Very
Close. Okay. For the record, my name is.
Can we charge somebody a fee to get new microphones? Can we do that? Do we have that ability?
I think Mr. Lucas will pay for it just on his own.
Excuse me, Gordon.
My name is Gordon Innes. I'm a senior engineer with the Division of Water Quality. Today's item concerns monitoring requirements for constituents of emerging concern in recycled water, and it's a proposed amendment to the recycled water policy to incorporate these monitoring requirements. The monitoring requirements are based upon an earlier science advisory panel recommending monitoring CECs in recycled water. The original report was produced sometime in 2010. Subsequent to that, the State Water Board held a hearing on it, and we subsequently developed a proposed amendment to the recycled water policy incorporating those requirements. This was released in May of this year. We received public comments on that proposal. We also received comments from scientific peer reviewers on the proposal, and we revised the policy, put out a second draft of it, and we received comments on the second draft last Tuesday. We have since made some additional revisions to the proposal, and those revisions should be before you as 2 change sheets. The first change sheet is shows the complete attachment A with revisions to it. The second change sheet shows one revision to the main body of the recycled water policy. Our attorneys have also been scrupulously looking through the language, and they found a couple of typos. The first one is in section 3.2, and on the last sentence of the first paragraph, and this is on page 9, where it says to approved, that should be to approval. Or it said, instead of to approved, it should be subject to approval. The next change is essentially the same change, but on page 14, where on section 3.3 in the first paragraph, where it says to approved, it should say to approval. Yeah, subject to approval. Okay. We received comments on both the requirements concerning landscape irrigation and monitoring for groundwater recharge reuse. For landscape irrigation, the Scientific Advisory Panel recommend that we not monitor for CECs and recycled water used for landscape irrigation. The reason was that, based on their risk assessment, they found that it was not necessary, primarily because the low amount of recycled water that would actually be consumed. And they did recommend some monitoring for CEC surrogates, and we included that monitoring in the initial drafts. However, in the change sheet version before you, we deleted that requirement. The reason we deleted it is that the surrogates that the panel was recommending for monitoring were the same surrogate, or were the same parameters that are required for monitoring under the Title 22 water recycling criteria. So we felt it was unnecessary to place these in the recycled water policy because they're already being required by California Department of Public Health. We also reduced the required monitoring for priority pollutants, and now the priority pollutant monitoring in the recycled water policy for landscape irrigation is once per year for facilities that produce more than 1 million gallons per day of recycled water. For smaller facilities, it's monitoring once every 5 years. This will reduce the monitoring costs for recycled water facilities. Comment letters received, there was general support from the recycled water community, although they did request some clarifications. We did receive other letters from the Heal the Bay, Heal the Ocean, Coastkeeper Alliance, and others that expressed concerns that the monitoring requirements were inadequate. And they recommended that we monitor for four CECs in recycled water used for landscape irrigation. We did get a letter from the Santa Clara Valley Water District, which referenced a study that they had recently completed. In this study, what they said was that they had been monitoring some of the sites where there has been landscape irrigation in the area. And at those sites, they did find some NDMA and some perfluorocarbons in shallow groundwater. And what the Santa Clara Valley Water District said, we recommend that you review this study and other similar studies when the update to the recycled water policy is made in the future. We believe that the monitoring requirements in the proposed amendment are appropriate given the certain state of the knowledge of CECs. And any future CEC monitoring in the future should be based upon scientifically identified risks. For groundwater recharge reuse, the Scientific Advisory Panel went through a screening process to come up with a set of health-based CECs to monitor. And in the screening process, they started out with a large list of CECs. And they looked at those CECs that did not have monitoring requirements, and there weren't robust monitoring requirements. They concluded it wasn't worth monitoring for those CECs. They also decided that there wasn't any toxicity data for a CEC, that CEC shouldn't be monitored. And they also looked at existing monitoring data for CECs in recycled water. And if we had been monitoring for that CEC for a while, and we found that the CECs either weren't being found in the recycled water or were being found at concentrations that were below monitoring trigger levels, the panel decided that that CEC wasn't worth monitoring either. So after that screening process, they came out with a list of 4 health-based CECs to monitor. The Scientific Advisory Panel also recommended that for these groundwater recharge reuse projects that a set of what they call performance indicator CECs be monitored. And these are CECs that aren't necessarily toxic, but they are good indicators of removal of a group of CECs from the process. So the removal of the performance indicator CECs indicates that other CECs of similar type are also being removed. The Scientific Advisory Panel recommended a phased monitoring program under which more frequent monitoring would be